Hi Tom, how are you?
Hi Nick, good to see you. Good to hear from you as well. It's great to be part of this.
Yeah, welcome to the Lives of the Artists. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Let me introduce you to the audience. So you are a director at the Florence Academy of Art in Florence, of course.
Yeah.
And what does a day as the director of Florence Academy of Art entail? What's an average day for
Sure.
you?
Um, I guess I have a number of jobs. So I guess I do that, as you said. I'm also a portrait painter in my own right. So depending on the day, I'm either at the school, which is on the edge of central Florence, and I'm often in my studio. So I get a lot of help to run the school. There's a full team in the office, and there are lots of other teachers.
Hmm.
Some of whom are portrait painters as well. So portrait painting is something that we all kind of live and breathe.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, an average day is spent sort of. I try to have at least 4 hours a day in my studio, and then depending on the day, either more time in the studio or a bit more time at the school as well. Some days I teach one full day a week there, and then I drop by at other times.
So you're in your studio every day. So I mean, your
Yeah.
main. I'm sorry, I didn't say that you are predominantly you're an artist. I mean, first and foremost, you're an artist. And would you say you're a portrait painter, or would you say you're a
Um,
landscape and portrait painter? How would you sort of say what you are?
I mean, I guess we're just coming out of the winter, and there are some people who are much braver as landscape painters than I am. So I'm a fair weather landscape painter. I paint landscapes when the weather's nice, and I paint portraits all year round. So I don't know. You can make of that what you will.
And so you're in your studio every day. So what is your typical day in your studio like? Do you
So,
have a routine that you like to
yeah.
sort of go by?
I mean, I try to get to the studio just around sort of 8 o'clock each morning, and the first 20 minutes I just draw from plaster cast for like 20 minutes just to kind of warm up, get my hand going. It's almost like a form of meditation, just to kind of get the. And I get to work on a bicycle, and just to get the kind of stress of the commute, the traffic, and everything else out of my system. Um, and then most of the time, I've done the prep work for that day the night before. So there's the paint's pretty much ready to go, brushes are ready to go. I prepare my palette, so I organize. I mean, the colors are quite easy. That they come out of. I hand grind the pigments, but they come out of tubes, and then I
So
tend to pre.
you make sure that that's all ready to go the day before. You'll grind all your pigments, so you don't have to worry about that in the morning.
What I'll do is I pre-mix like a tonal range on the palette, so I tend to mix specific colors by hand, but I have a range from just a kind of a pinky side of white to just inside black, and I have about, depending on the stage of the painting at the beginning, it's three values, and then as you go through the phases, it extends a little bit more. It's almost like tuning your piano. And so I might mix a lot of colors by hand, but I'm always comparing them on a light to dark scale to something I pre-mixed at the start of the day.
And what are your typical colors that you like to use on your
Sure.
palette? I mean, the palettes. Every artist has
Yeah.
variations of a basic palette.
Sure.
What's your go-to palette?
There's like a core set, and then it expands out from there. So I think like the training you had as well in Florence. There's lead white at the lightest end, and then black at the other, and there are a couple of options for black as well. And then a kind of a yellowish ochre, so it's like an earthy yellow. And then depending on the skin tones of the model, then you'll add other things to that. So different types of red depending on the type of the type of skin tones you're mixing. Different types of red, different types of yellow. Sometimes even blue, like a cobalt or an ultramarine blue as
Mm.
well. So depending on the specific sitter, and even according to let's say the clothes they're wearing. So someone's wearing a blue, let's say a silk blue coat, inevitably there's going to be some blue bouncing up into the head, and if you try to just paint that with black and white, it will look like the head's in a different world.
Yeah.
So, and you can see that I think in historically a lot of portrait painters, there's a core set of colors, and then they expand it according to the needs of the individual. I think that's a really
So is your
important
core
part.
set of colors like the Anders Zorn palette? So white, black, yellow, ochre, and vermilion, and then
Yeah, and then sometimes an earthier red if it's, let's say, like a darker skin model, a dark, Mediterranean, or you know, I think Zorn was painting up in Sweden, and this is before the 20th century where people moved all over the world. So he was dealing with people with very very pale skin, and the
mm,
vermilion's amazing for that. And as you move into a richer set of possibilities in terms of skin colors, then you're going to need more colors.
So a darker sort of earthier brown, and then variants would be. I mean, do you? So you're saying blue? Do you use any greens on your
A
palette?
cobalt or an ultramarine blue, and
Hmm.
then sometimes what I like having with each color is like a warm and it's like, so let's say with yellows I might have like a Naples yellow, which is like a burnt white lead, and then the yellow ochre, and the Naples yellow is slightly more colorful. It has a bigger impact when you mix it. Like it holds its color better with white and black, say,
Hmm.
but it's a little cooler than yellow ochre. So yellow ochre is a little duller but a little warmer, and then Naples yellow is a little more kind of chromatic. It keeps its color better. You know, if you mix it with black, it stays dark, but it goes a little greener.
Hmm.
And then with the reds, like say vermilion red is the more chromatic but cool, and then the earth red is a little warmer. And
Right, and
with all those different colors, you tend to have a kind of a warm, cool, high chroma, low chroma, and it just means that without having to have 25 colors, which gets confusing, you can answer those kind of: is it light or dark? Is it too light, too dark, too warm, too cool? And then colors kind of subservient to those other questions.
that's really interesting. And so, yeah, so you arrive at your studio around 8 o'clock, and then you warm up by doing some drawing, and then what
Yeah.
time will you start painting?
It depends a bit on the season. So my studio, I don't know if you've visited those ones at Piazzale Donatello. Like
I've never visited, but I've seen many pictures of them.
yeah,
They're absolutely stunning
yeah. So
studios.
it's a big kind of purpose built 19th century space with a huge north window. Although it's not actually north window. So this is the thing that all those artists from the 19th century onwards would have noticed, that especially in the summer, the light doesn't get really good until about 10 o'clock. So in the winter, you can paint from the moment it gets light because the sun never quite gets into that position. But just as the clocks have changed now, I just draw for a little bit longer, and I get the models to come at 10 o'clock,
Hmm.
and then I
And that's
stay.
when
Yeah, and then
and that's
stay.
when you typically start painting.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then how long do you paint for? Do you go I mean, how many hours can you paint in a day?
I mean, you can do a lot, but I find it's not a great idea to work for too long on one thing. You get very. I'm sure it's like so many, like lots of people who listen to this who might not be artists. Like anything you do in life, like having a fresh sense of what you're doing and whether it's any good is probably the hardest thing to do.
Mm.
And so if you work, I mean, the big danger of that is something like a self-portrait. You don't potentially need another model. You can just stay there all day, but nearly always by the end of the day, you're doing some pretty unhelpful things to the painting. So each day I try to have a figurative project, a non-figurative project, and then something else where I'm just learning.
And do you break it up into an hour in with each, 2 hours with each,
Sort of
3 hours?
blocks of two, like less than 2 hours. I find I can't. I think one of the lovely things with oil paint is the way that it kind of it dries quite slowly, and so
Mm.
the first hour and a half, you're just putting a lot of material down, and then the last section of the time you're kind of manipulating that. And so if the painting period is too short, you don't quite get to kind of move the paint around on the canvas, which is such a big part of it. There's lots of the people you feature on portrait paintings daily. I suspect that there had been a moment in the painting session where their paintings would have looked very similar. And one
Mm.
of the things that really distinguishes artists' handwriting is almost what they do with the paint once it's been put on the canvas. But the placement of a lot of those marks, if you're would have looked very, very similar at certain
Yeah,
moments.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the fascinating thing about portraits is the handwriting,
Yeah,
the signature handwriting of each artist that you look for. It's that mystery in a painting that you kind of yeah you it's almost like looking at the spirit of the artist, like
hmm
the spirituality of the artist almost. It's like that the paint is one thing, it's his tools, but it's the application and the way that he sort of draws the paint and molds the paint to his vision, that or her vision, that
yeah,
is the sort of fascinating artistry of a painting.
yeah. I think with a portrait, there's another really interesting part, which is, I mean, there's lots of different types of portraits. There can be, I can find someone on the street and just say, you're playing a role for me, and you do what I want. And then there's someone else comes to me and says, I want you to paint my portrait. And then there's also a group of people, it could be citizens, it could be a university or whatever, say, we want you to paint this other person for us. And each one of those changes that thing. So let's say, a lot of portrait painters in history were working in the sort of those second two ways a lot of the time. And so there's always this thing of like there's the subject, but also that often there's this thing of like the committee's voice and vision that you see in there too. So it's, at the end of the day, those paintings exist because they were happy with them.
It's also gone horribly wrong for very, very famous artists.
Yeah.
I mean, Rembrandt being one of them. He famously went bankrupt after his commission was for the town hall of Claudius Civilis was taken down and wasn't paid for, and he had to go to court and try and win the case. But amazing to think that someone like Rembrandt, one of the gods of painting, was refused. The commission was turned down or wasn't liked.
I mean, and even let's say Rembrandt, who I think I quite like this game of if you had to say, okay, who would I get to paint me if I was trying to be a little bit vain about it, and then who would I want to paint my worst enemy? I think I would want Rembrandt to paint my worst enemy because it would be hopefully this incredibly insightful and not necessarily conventionally beautiful image of that person. So in a way, like sometimes it's not a surprise that people found Rembrandt's portrayals difficult to live with. But it's even someone like Sargent, who was a great kind of, could be a great kind of flatterer. Sometimes you feel that this person probably had a couple of spots or a slightly wonky jaw, and they just looked like a kind of almost like a mannequin. And even he had trouble with people saying they didn't like the way he set them up.
No, I know, and you can also read news stories of how they made fun of the neck was too long or the nose was too big, and you're talking about John Singer Sargent, the greatest portrait painter of all time, who couldn't get it right for the media back then. It's interesting. It's interesting to kind of think about. So often when you're looking at the history of art, you hold these artists up like mythical gods, and you forget, which is the thing that I love to really delve into, is their everyday life. They were just human beings applying their trade, and they had all the difficulties that anyone else and challenges that anyone else has in life.
Trying to run a business, basically. And then other people, they had as you say, the issues of did people like it? Then let's say if you were someone like Cecilia Beaux, you had all of that stuff going on. The complications of being a woman painter at the start of the 20th century. So all these different people faced all these barriers that I think a lot of artists today would be very familiar with. And it's hard enough. We think of them these otherworldly characters. It's not that barrier, as you say, isn't helpful, because also I think it stops you at times looking at the paintings kind of objectively.
Yeah, it's hard enough being an artist, but imagine trying to be an artist where, as Cecilia Beaux was, a woman trying to be an artist in an age that that was frowned upon. Very, very, incredible story.
She's from what I understood, she was a brilliant teacher. She had a very simple way of explaining like form and perspective to students. She'd just hold up a box to them and she'd turn it in space and she'd say, as you see more of this side, you see less of that side. And said, if you can't understand that, there's no point going any further.
Right.
She was a really no nonsense, pretty tough kind of person, and just had a very practical, straightforward approach to making paintings. And I think she would enjoy the that demystification process that you're trying to bring to this as well.
Absolutely. She painted some stunning and very tender portraits. She really was sort of not very well known about, but really technically incredibly good. And just the kind of the stories that she tells within the paintings are beautiful.
Yeah, there's a great one if some of your viewers might enjoy it. I think it's even just called like Man with a Cat, and it's just a guy in a white, very sort of slick looking guy in a white suit with this amazing, beautifully painted cat on his lap. And there was a story at one exhibition when one of the reviewers said the best sergeants in the exhibition were painted by Cecilia Beaux.
Although I do see the difference between
big time.
Between her and Sargent, but maybe for the that sounds really pretentious, but for the untrained eye, maybe they do look quite similar. But I don't know. I obsess over portraiture, and so I can see huge differances. It's like
there are significant differences.
Yeah, it's like talking to someone, and they've all got, I don't know, like asking the Queen, they all look all your corgis look the same. She'd be very offended.
Very offended. She's not around to complain anymore. I wonder what she made of Lucien Freud's portrait of her.
Yeah, really interesting. I just did a piece about that actually, and she was, as as typically the Queen was, she was very polite about it and very sort of generous with her praise, and you know, it was a gift from Lucian Freud to the Queen. But I wonder what she really thought about it, because there's when you look, you know, when you look at people's opinion of it, there's probably more bad opinions than good opinions. It's rare that people love that painting.
I mean, her favorite portrait of herself was the Antigone one. Which,
do you like that one?
I mean, I think it's very. I mean, I think one of the things I always think about when I'm setting up my own you know, sitters, and then I find it's quite an interesting question to look at other paintings through. So it's like you have the individual, and then there's the archetype. So you have the Queen is obviously like, it's a job that you do, and it's an idea we have, you know, like the monarch and the head of state. And there's obviously there's a person who is also a mother who might be worried and might have concerns. So I think that's quite an interesting tension to look at a painting through. You know, is it the young student, and then there's John who has, or you know, Stacy who has whatever else is going on in their life, and then the other part is vanity versus vulnerability. And I think we're interested in, you know, in both. I think particularly when we're painted ourselves, I think we quite like to look nice, and then when we look at paintings of other people, I think we're very interested in vulnerability.
Well, I think that vulnerability is the interesting thing within a painting, and I think that Antigone painting of the Queen doesn't have it at all. It's almost like you can almost see in that portrait that he was so happy about getting this prestigious commission. He tried to make the Queen look like this.
Yeah, I think it's anyway. It's on that balance. It veers towards. It's weighted towards the archetype and towards vanity.
Yeah,
and I would say probably Lucian Freud's probably is at the extreme other end as well. And I think, you know, maybe. No, it's interesting. I was in Rome this weekend looking at the Velasquez portrait of Pope Innocent.
Yeah, incredible.
And I think that's one of these, you know, very rare masterpieces that manages to find a very happy equilibrium between all of those four. You know, you're immediately aware you're looking at a pope. He sits in a very dignified way. You know, the lighting on his face, you know, the refinement of the features and so on. And he's not trying to undermine the office, but at the same time, you're aware that you're looking at a person who has, you know, doubts and worries, and you know, is a complicated person. And I think there are, you know, there are other portraits in the history of art that do that too. But I think it's, you know, when I look at it in terms of, you know, as I said, the individual and the archetype, and then vanity, vulnerability, you know, it's just one of those that just sits so happily, and you can feel all of those 4 points of tension pulling in such an amazing way and with such unbelievable balance.
I think that's a really good example, the Velasquez portrait of the Pope, because it's exactly what you say. There's a tension between vulnerability and his position as one of the most powerful men in the world, but it doesn't overstate any of it, and it's also technically such an achievement.
That's extraordinary.
And Van Dyck painted a very similar portrait, not of a Pope. I think it's of a cardinal. Do you know the one where he's sort of clutching?
The one in Florence.
The one in Florence. The one in Florence, but he's wearing black, not
okay,
the one in
okay.
I think it's in Genoa.
That one.
And he's wearing a black robe, and he's gripping quite hard. He's gripping, but it's based on the image, on the Velasquez image, clearly.
It might have actually can't be because Van Dyck died before that. I think they're probably based on the Titian one. There's a Titian prototype of because there's one of Titian of Pope Paul with this kind of these bony fingers. It's in Naples. And so, yeah, because the Velasquez was painted in 1650.
So that wouldn't have informed Van Dyck's portrait?
No.
That's interesting. I always just assumed that was a sort of interpretation of the Velasquez Pope portrait. But anyway, back to what you were saying, there's a sinisterness to that pose. It's sort of, there is a vulnerability, but there's just this absolute balance of tension with the Velasquez painting, whereas with the Van Dyck painting, there's more of a sort of malevolence almost when you're looking at that. You know, like this man had power and used it in a corrupt way, maybe. But you don't get that sense in the Velasquez portrait.
No, I mean, I think that thing of balance is. I mean, he's what I love whenever I look at his work is you're always aware that you're looking at a Velasquez painting. You know, there's no escaping that. But at the same time, he's one of those painters that doesn't, in a strange way, there are principles that underlie his painting. Like, you know, he understands light and dark. The drawing is beautiful, but he doesn't actually have a formulaic approach. let's say there are lots of his paintings that, let's say don't have highlights in the eyes, or so it's not you just put two little white dots in. That Van Dyck at times, like Van Dyck's hands at times get a little formulaic, and Velasquez really characterizes the hand according to Van Dyck's hands are beautiful, but like there's no way everyone had those beautiful long hands. And with Velasquez, you feel that he looked at people without prejudice. He was just looking to say, how can I use your body, your face, the way that you wear your clothes to make a painting? And he didn't have let's say, he changed the way that he painted during his life as well, as a way to try and not so much in a stylistic way, but it was a way to try and be more truthful. And I think that's such an amazing, it's such an extraordinary thing. I think, Rembrandt has something similar, but there is this kind of big veil of style with Rembrandt. I think Velasquez as a naturalistic painter, for me, is so special because you feel he doesn't have a way of painting hands. He doesn't have a way of painting eyes. It's and that's such a rare thing in the history of art.
So what do you think was going on there? Because when you're looking at Velasquez's career, he was trying things early on, but there's a sea change from sort of mid career. He was just painting at an extraordinary level. His early paintings were good, solid paintings, but if he died at whatever 35, he probably wouldn't be remembered as a great.
No, I mean, I think obviously, like Rubens came to we mentioned Van Dyck, and Rubens, who was formed by Van Dyck. Rubens came to Spain, and I mean, I think Velasquez got two things out of that meeting. I think one was that Rubens told him to go to Italy, and he went to Italy and more than anything studied Titian, but also Raphael and Michelangelo and so on. I think there's a lot of classical sculpture in Velasquez's work too. I mean, there's the visual impression and this idea that things don't jump out of sequence, but a lot of that I think is he was looking at a lot of classic. If you think of like a classical bust as opposed to say, let's say something super expressive from Germany. The way that they deal with lines on faces in classical sculpture, you really feel the big form turning, and that ability, which he didn't really understand in quite the same way before that, to still characterize a face, to be incredibly specific with all of these angles and to give you a skull, but really everything is subordinate to the way the head turns in space. And so I think he got lots of things from Titian and Raphael, Michelangelo and trips around Italy, but he got a huge amount, and he bought a lot of classical sculpture for the Spanish royal court as well.
So that's really interesting. So you think his trip to Italy, sort of midway through his life,
changed everything.
Changed everything, and you think specifically looking at Titian more than anyone else changed everything.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have quite the same records. I mean, Van Dyck had left this amazing sketchbook, and Van Dyck had been a couple of years before Velasquez. Rubens had sent him off to go and learn, and we know from Van Dyck's sketchbook basically where he went and what Rubens told him to look at. And
he too was obsessed with Titian. His sketchbooks are full of Titian portraits, sketches of Titian.
And a few other things, but it's very much that's the crux of it. And so I think that's it's highly likely they even travelled with the same person. So there was this guy called Spinola who was a sort of ran between Spain and Genoa, and so it's so likely they would have had the same introduction, seen the same work in private houses. And Rubens would have given them a kind of a shopping list of you've just got to go and study this painting and you'll learn a lot from it. And the other thing Rubens did a portrait of the Spanish king, and I think Velasquez was watching that, and the angle in which he sets the king's face changes completely from that time. And the king had this sort of the Habsburg jaw, and he was not a conventionally beautiful man. And so how to make it look like the individual, how to make it look like a king, which is probably more important in a pre-photographic age. This man has to look regal and dignified. And suddenly Rubens has unlocked that way of not just how to paint technically, but how to set up that particular model, which was his job as court painter. And I think that was a hugely important thing that Rubens gave him, was just the actual angle. And almost from that moment, so many of the portraits of the king that Velasquez did are from more or less the same angle.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's really fascinating insight into his life and the way he sort of changed the way he looked at things.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I love with someone like, obviously in a pre-photographic moment, we don't quite know how, we're so formed by photography. It's very difficult to take that out of our heads. And the thing I really enjoy looking at with Sargent paintings is when you look at, let's say, about 10 of them, and you look at, like, okay, where was the model lined up in height to the artist? Where did the light come from? And you can see how much he changed those things all the time to get, again, to kind of, I mean, Sargent is a little bit more sometimes borders, as you were saying with the necks earlier, on kind of caricature, or is happy to exaggerate. But living in a photographic age, he couldn't take massive liberties, but he could set people up in very interesting ways as a way to heighten the drama of someone's appearance. And you see when there are those wonderful books that Richard Orman did with every Sargent in, and if anyone's, you can tell more or less from looking at where someone's shoulders are in relationship to their neck, whether he's looking down or looking up at someone. It's a really good clue. And if you flick through those books and you look at the height someone's at in relationship to Sargent, and then you look at the angle of the light and the height of the light, and he'd mostly painted in his own studio or set up people in big rooms where he could more or less mimic studio conditions. And you can see how that idea of not just painting the person, but how important the setup is for great portrait artists. Not just you're always at eye level, but how much they subtly change things to bring out the sitter's character.
But interestingly enough, there's a real connection that people have with Velasquez that they just don't get with Van Dyck or Rubens. Like, they really feel connected internationally. People love Velasquez. What is that? What is that connection that they just don't get with a Van Dyck or a Rubens?
I mean, I think, although I think Velasquez is really clever at like hiding his sources. So when you look at those paintings, you're not thinking of classical sculptures, even though that's a huge part of it. With Van Dyck, you still feel this kind of almost like there's a Renaissance veil between.
But almost like an academic veil. It's like, look how good I am at painting, and then that's kind of it. It doesn't sort of lead you in. It doesn't invite you in to ask, who is this sitting? Like, when you're looking at that portrait of the Pope, there's just a real tenderness to it, as well as a power to it. There's something very mysterious about that Velasquez captures.
But I think in some of his more personal and private work, Van Dyck does do that, but he was doing a lot of official portraits, and for a lot of different people, whereas Velasquez was working more or less for the same in the court. And so he was very close to. There's a beautiful painting I think people would enjoy looking at, of a sculptor called Montanes, and he's sculpting a bust of the king. It's in the bottom corner. It's in the Prado, and there were special rules in those days. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but it's like les majestés. Like, if you could not speak badly about the king, you couldn't do a cartoon of the king or anything else. When you look at how the king's head is, the sculpture of the king is painted, it's like a cartoon. So you've got to be very, very confident that the king is not going to get cross with your depiction of him in that way.
Yeah, it seems like Velasquez was very trusted by the king.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that helps him to present the king in a way that perhaps some other more official court painters haven't quite had that same license. And then also, there are things like the jesters, the series of dwarves, and these other people that were hanging around in the court. And so, because these were not ever really intended for public display, it gave Velasquez license to, produce things which are, modern in many senses of the word. They're paintings of doubt, of uncertainty, whereas, Velasquez's works are, the most beautiful, sophisticated propaganda you could ever imagine, but you're always kind of looking at propaganda.
Well, you are and you aren't. I mean, those pictures of the dwarfs are very tender and very strange for the time. There's a deep psychology to them that
even the king of Van Dyck is propaganda. Velasquez absolutely is not a propagandist.
I see exactly what you mean. Yeah, I see exactly what you mean. Yeah. Sort of like you say, he was commissioned a lot. People he didn't really know. He had to deliver a certain type of quality of portrait to these, very powerful people. Whereas Velasquez was working with the same trusted subjects and people in the court that he knew, and I get the sense that he was friends with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, Van Dyck was making people's business cards. People would, these were often being turned into engravings that would then be sent ahead of you when you were going to travel somewhere, and this would be, you can recognize me by this, and so it's, he's a wonderful painter. But I think, again, there are times where you feel, and in such a seductive way. I mean, if you grew up in the UK, you can't escape that, and you love portraits, you can't escape Van Dyck, and I don't want to escape Van Dyck. He's a wonderful artist, but the three people that I go back to time and time again are Velasquez, Rembrandt, and actually I think for grand portraits, Titian is still the one I find, because there's this veil of kind of poetry there, and softness and light, and especially for children. Actually, I mean, sometimes portrait painters hate painting kids, and I think Titian's a wonderful. There's a beautiful painting of a little boy. I think it's called Ranuccio Farnese, and
I know the one.
he's dressed up in his dad's clothes, in that funny way that you might put on your dad's like football jersey or cricket sweater to try and look more manly and big, and you actually end up looking even more diminutive and small. And I think it's just such a lovely painting of that specific moment in childhood at about 10 or 11 years old. And you've got kids. I'm sure you've sort of seen that kind of phenomenon yourself.
Absolutely. When I'm looking at we're getting back to the kind of spirituality and the brushwork and things like that, and the signature of the way an artist paints. When I look at a Titian and a Rembrandt, I get the same feeling. This feeling of looking into their soul, seeing these brushwork, this sort of brushwork that's just very mysterious, that much more academic when you're looking at a Van Dyck. Look how clever he was at doing that. But there's this strange mystery that I get that sense when I look at a Titian, the same as I look at a Rembrandt.
And well, actually, one of the things I've really started to enjoy in the last few months is so the person that started who I took over from the Florence Academy, someone called Daniel Graves, who's also a portrait artist. But one of the things he's really been a big part of his life and career is etching. And Rembrandt is the most amazing producer of portrait etchings ever. I mean, there's no two ways about it. No one ever etched portraits like Rembrandt. And because it's small, and because the brush marks are so tiny, they made the little tiny, incising tool on copper and then printed. You have to look through a magnifying glass. If you want to really see the hand, you have to look through a magnifying glass. And it brings this level of intimacy to that process and takes it to a whole new level. You're looking at this, just amazing way that his hand moved I can't remember who wrote it. I think he was talking about Leonardo da Vinci and said, he didn't just paint nature, but his hand moved like nature, in the sense that with the same variety of, leaves growing off a branch. They don't grow 1, 2, 3, 4 in a neat little line. And when you look at the way that Rembrandt creates, like an eye or the reflected light around a nostril, it's just so beautiful and so surprising. If you cut that head in half and looked at the left side, you'd have no idea how he was going to resolve the right hand side. It's a complete surprise. In just the same way, if you take a beautiful oak tree in a field and you block out one side, you have no idea what that other half looks like. It's beyond your ability to, nature comes up with these surprising, these wonderfully surprising things. And Rembrandt is one of these artists, as you say, that has that mystical approach to character, and just this seemingly endless range of technical solutions to try and explain those things.
And yet, like Velasquez, his early work is so different from his late work. It's good, but it's not incredible. I mean, Velasquez's early work is probably stronger than Rembrandt's early work, but his late work is just a complete sea change. I mean, it's like not even the same artist almost.
I suppose he was always interested in, he was always painting light, and he was always fascinated in like human expression. I think those are probably the only the constants you can come back to in his work. There's never a Rembrandt painting or print where there isn't a beautiful explanation of creation of an explanation of light. And okay, there are a few pure landscapes, very few, but even when you see a figure kind of gesturing on a shoreline in a very simple drawing of a riverbank, there's still this his understanding of how just an arm movement or the tilt of a head can convey a feeling. And there are those books that Titian brought out, that all the paintings and all the drawings and prints, and the one I go back to time and time again is the prints and drawings, partly because I think the reproductions are better, but also I think when you look at the drawings, and particularly the prints, you really you feel this very intimate relationship with the artist.
And Tom, you were recently commissioned to paint a painting for a church. Was that in Florence, or what was the story behind that?
Sure, it was by the people who own the football team here, so Fiorentina, and it was bought by an Italian-American couple. So he's called Rocco Commisso and his wife Catherine, and they rebuilt the training facility, which is out on the edge of the city, out to the east, actually just across the river from the school. and their architect got in touch to say they were looking for someone to paint. It was a Madonna and Child and the chapel was being named after Catherine. So it was, I mean, perhaps controversially for Florence, but it was St. Catherine of Siena, who's the third figure in the painting. And so
this was for the chapel at the training ground
of
Fiorentina.
Yeah. And then, which is, I mean, it's pretty rare to build a new church these days. Obviously, around the world, church attendance is declining. So the cardinal came along and we had the consecration. He was sort of throwing holy water, and they had relics and all these other things. It's a long service, the consecration. I mean, people think that marriages or baptisms take a while. The consecration is like a 4-hour, marathon. But it's a beautiful space, and it was a very special thing to be involved in. And reading about, I mean, it's not when you paint St. Catherine, it's not like a portrait of her, but I did a lot of research into her life, and there are lots of, I guess, in the same way that when you're painting a person, you have these, we're all multifaceted, complicated individuals, and trying to work out. She was an incredibly intelligent woman who, went off to Avignon to go and broker peace agreements between the different warring parts of the Catholic Church. She was a scholar. When she was famously beautiful as a younger person, and would regularly cut off her hair and almost starve herself. And so again, talking to them and working out how dramatically we wanted these things to be present or not present in the painting. No, it was. Yeah.
So what were the parameters that you had to work by? What did they tell you that you had to do? Or
I mean, the size was completely specific, so it could be no bigger than that. And
what was the size?
We had a little bit of a backwards and forwards about whether we would include John the Baptist, who's the great patron saint of Florence. But in the end, it was decided just to have the three figures. And then the architecture of the church is very simple and very modern. So the background of the painting is really just an echo of the architecture of the church itself. And originally they were thinking of having a relief sculpture, and then in the end they decided they wanted a painting to be the kind of the one note of color in the chapel.
Interesting. And how did they reach out and find you?
I mean, I'm not entirely sure exactly how that happened, but I was in my studio painting, and I got a call from this nice guy in Canada saying, the owners of Fiorentina would like to talk to you about the painting. What are you doing for the next couple of hours? And there's a car waiting outside, kind of thing. So
so you were whisked off to kind of.
I mean, had a meeting with them and a few of the people who work at the football club, and no, it was at the. It was a really interesting chapter of my life, and I've been to a few Fiorentina games before and everything else, and we both enjoy watching games occasionally, and just to see behind the scenes at a modern football club, and to watch that whole project get built as well, visiting over time, seeing how the painting was looking and what needs to be made lighter and darker to really fit in that space.
And what was the time period from this call that you got in your studio to delivering the painting or to the consecration?
It had to be done pretty quickly, so I didn't have that long. I mean, the painting had to be done in about, I had just over a month to do the painting.
Wow.
And so, I mean, again, I think this is one of the things I really learned was, if you thinking about, let's say, someone like Velasquez, and he also painted some religious pictures as well. And it's very obvious when you look at the Madonna and his paintings, it's, he's obviously looking at a person, because the way that he paints the movement of light over the skin, there's no way you make that up, but at the same time, it's an idealized face. So I found I had someone posing, but I also used sculpture. And so it was a vibration. One day I'd paint from a sculpture and I'd correct their features to fit an idealized head. And then the next day I'd have the model back. And it was this kind of, vibration between using etchings that other people had done, using paintings.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I never thought about it that way.
Because you can't, I mean, nothing comes from nowhere, and you need, I wanted the light on the head to look, convincing. And if you invent it, you never get that amazing way that, warm and cool tones move over skin. But equally, if it looks too much like the girl from the cafe down the road, it's never going to seem holy. And so, you have to try and find that balance between the things you've experienced directly, and then almost like, trying to bring some sense of like a dream. This moment never actually happened. The Virgin was dead long before St. Catherine was alive. So how do you place them coherently in one place? That was probably the biggest challenge.
Wow. When you were growing up, do you remember if there was ever a moment where you saw a painting and you thought that you would like to be an artist? Was there like a time that you can remember?
Yeah, very clearly. I mean, I loved it as a kid. I mean, I really, when I was very little, I really loved drawing. And then perhaps like lots of children, I wanted to play cricket for England, and then fairly quickly realised that was a non-starter. But when I was 17, so it was back just before the turn of the millennium, it was an amazing year for exhibitions of, apart from anything else, portrait painters in London. So there was a Van Dyck show at the Royal Academy, which was amazing. There was a big Sargent show at the Tate, which I loved, and there was a show of just Rembrandt self-portraits at the National Gallery.
Wow!
And you can still get that catalogue on Amazon. And I just remember being in that room thinking, these painted heads seem more alive and more interesting to me than anybody else in the room, which is a little bit psycho if you think about it. But anyway, I remember thinking this so clearly. Like, I want to know who you are, and I also want to know how is this done? I mean, I was already painting a lot. I was doing art A level and everything else, but just it felt like it was. It wasn't so much a painting of a person; it was a person made out of paint.
And specifically, the Rembrandt self-portraits had that impact on you.
Yeah, I mean, like like when I looked at the Van Dycks and the Sargent, they were wonderful. They're beautiful images, but they were paintings of people. And when you looked at the Rembrandts, it was they were people made out of paint.
Yeah, they're incredible. There's no other paintings that I can think of that have that impact. That I know what you mean by that. They're sort of, when you look at them, it's almost like they're more real than the people in the room. And it's like he's saying, look, I'm not perfect, but do you think you're perfect?
Yeah,
it's sort of questioning you. Look at me. This is all I could do. My life, I could just paint what I am and try and live the best life that I could live. But it's sort of, there's a questioning that I get from it. Like when I'm looking at Rembrandt, especially the late self-portraits, I'm thinking to myself, what's my life about? What does it all mean? Like that, it makes you question everything. There's so much power to those paintings.
Yeah. No, they're a world in themselves. And I think that's a it's very, very special. I think Philippe Guston, who's a modernist painter, he wrote about Rembrandt a lot, and he said that with lots of artists, when you look at the canvas, think if I peeled away the paint, I would find canvas. He said when I feel Rembrandt, if I were to peel away the paint, there would be literally the hole. I would have made a hole in a physical being, and that's like there's something in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Lucian Freud famously said that when he looks at a Rembrandt self-portrait, he thinks to himself, "Wow, a head! What a good invention!"
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you couldn't be more like that could only be a painting, but somehow you don't think of the process of painting. You think of the thing that's been painted, and it applies to the way he paints fabric. There are other people that might paint fabric more stylishly, but he gives you time and time again the essence of things, and that's something very very special and very rare.
And I'm constantly thinking, wow, how's he done that? I mean, I've seen some of these paintings I've seen 100 times, but I'm still thinking to myself, how's he done that? I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the Kenwood House portrait, the self-portrait. Simplicity in the clothing and the detail in the face, and you think to yourself, has he finished the clothes? Did he mean to do more? Like, the face looks so detailed, but also there's areas that look it's just, I can endlessly look at that painting. That painting, above all, I would have that painting. If I could have any painting in the world, it would be that painting.
Although equally, I have this recurring nightmare, which is I'm in a big group exhibition in this kind of fancy place, and the two paintings either side of mine are a Rembrandt, and everyone's just laughing at my painting.
Have you really had that
yeah,
nightmare?
A lot. Yeah.
You never know, that might happen one day.
Don't know about that. With the proceeds of a picture a couple of years ago, I actually bought a tiny Rembrandt etching. So I have that, but I don't keep it in my studio because I can't have it. It'd be too. I find even living in Florence, where there's not that much of that. There's like the one artist here in Florence who I can't paint after having been with Michelangelo.
Yeah,
it's just too heavy.
Right.
It's too kind of good in every sense. It's just too powerful, too heavy, too kind of, what the hell's the point in what I'm about to do?
You go back to your studio and
I just have to go for a walk. And
yeah.
That's so there. When someone says, you've got an hour. Oh, let's go to the academia. If I'm painting that afternoon, I have to say no. I'm not going to go because I just it's too much actually. And
Yeah, but there are some. I know what you mean, but there are also some paintings that I look at and I think, God, that looks fun. I want to try. Like the Russian paintings, the Russian sort of school of painting.
Yeah,
they just look like so much fun.
Well, like Repin and people.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, he's a wonderful artist. I mean, one of my colleagues at the school is a guy called Vitali Stanko, and through him I've got to know a lot of these artists. Their work a lot better, and discovered all these people that I just didn't know about before. And yeah, there was a beautiful Repin show in Paris a couple of years ago, and before I started working at the Florence Academy, I would never have gone to Paris to see a Repin show. It never have occurred to me, and I'm so grateful for that contact with a kind of an international, with a really international group of artists, and it's just expanded my horizons in so many wonderful ways. And
he was part of a group of artists called the Wanderers or the Itinerants, and they basically believed that art, like a lot of sort of turn of the century philosophy, it came out of Russia, and communism and things like that. But I mean, their particular philosophy, this group of artists, was that they didn't that art wasn't for the elites, that it was actually for the everyday man. And they used to very wealthy patrons used to fund shows all around Russia where they would paint, as Ilya Repin famously did, just poor people or normal everyday people that were workers and serfs or whatever they were called at the time, and they would just show this representational art to the masses basically, and that was very much their philosophy. They didn't believe in this elitism, and I still think there's a place for that today.
100%. I mean, I think the whole point is it should be for one of the things I really miss living here. I think one of the most beautiful things in London, I hope it never changes, is the National Gallery is free. I mean, you did think about where if you live in Somerset, and let's say if for a family of four, the cost of getting train tickets to go up to London, and then if you had to pay another 20 quid each to go into the gallery, I mean that becomes an incredibly expensive day for most of the population. No surprise that people wouldn't do it.
I'd pay not to take my children around the National Gallery. It's more hassle than it's worth, but I've tried many times because it's free. I give it a go. I walk in, and it's incredible just having that luxury in England.
It's really beautiful and very important. I mean, there are churches and things here, but it's that's a different thing. But it's such a powerful thing that that's managed to kind of cling on in the UK. I mean, you feel that at some point it's going to come under a lot of pressure, but and they say, oh, why do tourists get it for free and everything? Like, I don't know. I mean, these things, as you say, they either belong to everyone or they don't.
Yeah, and if you look at the collection, most of it is, from Italy, it's from France, it's from all over the world. It should be an international collection that's, sort of a cultural, it's like a cultural duty just to enable it free for people to see.
No, and then for some people, like say, you might work in an office nearby, and you just go and look at one painting at lunchtime. For other people, it's going to change your life, and you're going to want to be an artist. And there isn't a right or a wrong reaction to those things. Just looking at something beautiful for the sake of it as a scholar. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to this idea that there's one way to look at a painting, or even that a painting might just contain one message. I mean, Velasquez is another great. Think of Las Meninas. There are so many interpretations of some of them seem pretty crazy, but there are so many interpretations of that painting. And it'd be interesting if Velasquez was sitting with us now and you asked him, rather like if you asked Rembrandt how he made the painting, he'd probably just shrug and go like, I can't remember.
Yeah, although he did have a lot of students. I don't think Velasquez did, but Rembrandt had a lot of students. So I'm sure he had a very, he was sort of quite a good educator. I get the sense that he liked people and he liked to have a group around him.
So he loved people.
Yeah. I mean, you get the sense from his nose by the end of his life that he was drinking a lot and probably socializing a lot. And you get the sense that his studio was probably quite chaotic and a lot of people coming through. I mean, I'm totally interpreting all of this as I want to see it, and who knows? It might not have been like that at all. But
I mean, if you can't, romanticize the things you love, what the hell are we doing? I think also it's like, because he was a complicated person. I think being married to Rembrandt would have been a pretty miserable experience.
Yeah.
He was pretty selfish in the way that he spent his money and organized his life. It's interesting. I think if Rembrandt,
typical artist.
Yeah, I mean, Rembrandt was trained by artists who didn't, and none of his pupils. Again, when Fabricius died young, which is the one who probably had the most talent, but it's interesting how, probably with the exception of Rubens' studio, so many of the great artists were trained by kind of like lesser spirits. They're often trained by, let's say, really technically gifted, very technically kind of, on it. Because what do you want from education? You want to learn how to do something. But then but sometimes when these great artists whose vision was so strong, that can actually be a very claustrophobic environment for. And it's impossible not to have your own view dominated by that. One of the things we always talk about at school is like try to find your inspiration as far back as possible. Because in a way, if you're looking at a painting from 1200, you've got 800 years of interpretation. If you're looking at what someone painted yesterday, you're inevitably going to be taking their solutions. So if you like a hand gesture, don't think about necessarily the way it's painted, but you're thinking of like, what does that hand say? It's a very different question.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I think what's so interesting is like Michelangelo was taught by Ghirlandaio, who didn't produce the most dynamic work, but gave Michelangelo an unbelievably kind of solid grounding in the principles of putting a fresco together. And then studying classical sculpture in the San Marco garden. And Rembrandt's the same. He was trained by these kind of relatively anonymous painters whose work hasn't come down to sort of the same fame, but they gave him that grounding, and then he was able to build on that, at times disregard it. I think in a strange way that most tennis coaches, Roger Federer's tennis coach was not a 18 major winner.
Yeah, more often than not, the people that taught the great masters were fairly average artists, but there are there are exceptions to the rule.
Yeah. Like Rubens is the great one, I think. I mean, whenever I feel busy or overwhelmed in life, I always think, get a grip of yourself. Like Rubens was running 3 houses, basically running a country, covering football pitches worth of canvas every week. A studio with 80 people. I mean, and this is in a pre-electronic light, pre-electronic communication. I mean, the guy's a monster.
He would have had the most fabulous life. It would have been an incredible life that he lived. But I think that also having that huge studio lets his paintings down more often than not. I look at a Rubens and there's a kind of there's not the depth that you can see in a Rembrandt painting. No. And when you see a Rubens that is painted by his hand only, they're incredly special.
They're amazing.
But so many of his paintings are the studio of Rubens. Like I'm thinking of in Antwerp Cathedral, those altarpieces there are just out of this world, and they feel different from other Rubens paintings.
Or even that little study of his daughter that's in Liechtenstein. So just as you say, these grand images, these big religious paintings, and some of the most powerful and moving religious art ever painted. And also, he could do these little tiny stuff. Like his drawings are lovely too, actually. His kind of chalk drawings of the figure, or even of trees and landscapes. He's a wonderful. I think he had this. I mean, a little bit like Rembrandt. I think what they shared was kind of just a lust and a joy of being alive. They expressed it in different ways, but you feel that sense of, just life and movement running through all of Rubens's work,
and a joy of painting. They just enjoyed painting so much.
Yeah.
And it's funny when people criticize like Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst for having these huge studios of workers and things like that. You look at Rubens, he probably had 25 people working for him.
Well, I mean, I think there's a subtle difference in that. I mean, I take your point on one level, and then, let's say Rubens has Van Dyck, and of course Van Dyck is very good at painting heads, but when Rubens says to him, Rubens could take the brush at any moment and correct their work. And he could do everything that he's asking his assistants to do. And very often the time, these big contemporary artists are asking their assistants or other people to do things that technically they just don't know how to do.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think it's a really important difference, actually. I mean, I think the workshop is one thing, and I have nothing, against people who have people to help them clean their brushes, even to do parts of the paintings. But I think the whole point is that the master should be able to take the brush at any moment and correct that work. and bring it up to the level if it's a kind of his piece rather than just a studio piece. And I think we all know for a fact that, as you say, these giants of the contemporary scene are kind of, what do you call it, just handing out work to third parties simply because they don't know how to do those things.
Yeah, no, I take your point. That's absolutely true. It's like, you get the impression that Damien Hirst is trying to conceive of these very conceptual ideas, and it's like, who can I get to do that? I have no idea how to do it. Whereas Rubens conceived of ideas that he could do, but he just had so much on his plate, he needed the help to execute.
And there are even some of those Rembrandt drawings where you can see him retouching his students' drawings as well. I mean, they're kind of I remember Richard Serrin, who died a couple of years ago. You probably remember from your time in Florence as well. Did some really wonderful lectures on kind of Rembrandt studio with a similar veil of romance that we both have, but some wonderful insights as well.
And are there any contemporary painters that you like looking at now? I mean, you said that your biggest influence would be Velasquez, Titian, and Rembrandt. But does modern contemporary art interest you? Does it get you excited to look at?
I mean, it does, in the sense that like lots of my friends are artists, and I love seeing what they've done, and like I really I enjoy their success. But in a sense, in terms of I think anyone that can make a go of it as an artist is like worthy of interest. How are they doing it? How do they organize their life? Like it might be that the discipline, all sorts of things. It takes so much to make it go. But in terms of looking at paintings, no, I look at dead people.
Right.
I think like every living artist is always about to do their best painting.
And
that's fantastic, and it should be like that. And with a dead artist, you can just look at their work as a whole, and you have a different relationship to it. And so I most of my day-to-day conversations are with living artists, and I love looking at their work, being in their studios, and there's nothing more like that gives you more in terms of energy and inspiration. But for let's say for guidance, I go to the past.
There'll be a lot of people watching this or listening to this that maybe are just starting their story and their journey in art, and they might not have the ability or be able to go to art school, go to Florence to study at the Florence Academy of Art, but they still have that passion and that desire to learn how to paint and to learn how to draw. What advice, as the director of the Florence Academy of Art, would you give someone like that that's watching in where their home somewhere, anywhere in the world?
Wherever. I mean, I'd say, I think you touched on this idea earlier. Ultimately, you have to make the paintings you think the world needs, or sculptures. So these things, even if it's an official commission, it has to touch you. So you have to find and identify the things that touch you and inspire you. Most things, on one level, have already been done. But I'd say if you're trying to learn, like, find a way to get a strong light on your face, on your hand, or whatever else. And so you're looking at, a light shape, something which is pretty dark, like a shadow, and there's a highlight in there, ideally from one direction, and just look at it for a long time, and then look at great paintings and just see how that map of light and dark and space has been created, has been translated in lots of different ways. And I think that's, there isn't one way, but there are certain foundational principles. And if you can understand, if there's a light coming from one particular direction, how does that form that I'm painting sit in relationship to the light and the space around it? And just start, tentatively using, let the best painters of all time be your, let the paintings you really love be your teachers. And I think it's much less creepy than a Ouija board. Like they can give you very living advice.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about art. It lives on. I mean, life is short. That famous quote, "Life is short, art is long."
I mean, if you let's say what you probably can buy quite cheaply is like a plaster cast of like a head or a hand. And let's say if you said you're going to you'd be able to put some of these images up. If it takes something like a hand, and then look online for a Spanish artist called Giuseppe Ribera, Ribera, and just say, okay, I'm going to shine a light into a little black shoebox kind of thing that I've hacked to pieces, and I'm going to try and create a feeling of light on that hand that looks a bit like a hand in a Ribera painting. and then you can use the Ribera painting to help you understand how to move light and shadow around.
So get a cast of a hand, set
Or
it
a,
up
or a head or something, yeah.
or a head or something, and then get a painting to see how a master an old master that you like looking at, whether it be Rembrandt, Ribera, or Van Dyck, or whoever,
might have translated those things.
Might have translated it, and then just try and
then learn a bit from that. I think
to do your version.
That balance of looking at the world around you. Sometimes the reason plaster casts are nice is that, like, my own hand is a very complex shape, and I really have to translate it. It's a complex thing to translate, 3D to 2D. When you look at a plaster cast, you're still doing that amazing thing of 3D to 2D, but it's already been translated into a work of art.
Yeah, I'd recommend starting with a head, because I think hands are harder to paint than heads.
all of it. I mean, anything, but like, it can be. I mean, heads are nice, big symbols, but also we have that kind of psychological link to a head, and that can make it harder too. So even just solids, like just getting a white, like an egg, is an amazing thing to learn how to draw.
Yeah,
because like if your outline is too rigid, it will look like a disc. It won't have volume, and then how, even though it's not quite as, let's say, generic as a circle, it actually has quite a specific structure. So just learning how to, if you can draw an egg, you can pretty much draw anything. Actually, it's really complex. And really make it seem as deep as it is wide. I mean, I think the big challenge, because again, in this photographic age, is to really understand how form works. I think that's the really fundamental thing is to try and learn to translate form. Even if you're working from a photograph, which at times is inevitable for almost any living artist, it's trying to turn that 2D image in your head into a form and then back onto a 2D canvas again. And that's probably one of the things that I think a lot of people, when you look at a lot of contemporary work, it's the absence of form that's probably the biggest weakness with respect to the paintings I really love in the past.
Yeah, the flatness and the absence of form. That's a very good point. If you could have any painting, just quickly before we go, if you could have any painting in the world, what painting would you choose?
I mean, it's I guess probably my answer would change all the time. I mean, I guess Kenwood House is out because you've got that hanging in your house now.
Yeah, that's in mine. Sorry.
So having just seen the Velasquez Pope, I mean, it would be a pretty unnerving thing to hang over my bed. But if it was in a sort of a safer part of the house where I could look at it, maybe not last thing at night. I think having, it would sort of it would send you out of the door with a sense of purpose each day.
Yeah, absolutely. When I look at that painting, it just there's a sense of power. That man, he just exudes power, and he has captured that. It's very easy. I mean, I think the Titian Pope that he painted, I think he painted that not from life. It was from sketches, and he sort of imagined what the Pope would be like. But I don't think it's as successful, as he sort of looks a bit weak and a little bit. I mean, it's still an amazing painting.
A bit older.
Yeah, but do you know what I mean? Like, there's just a sense of incredible power in that Velasquez painting.
And it's also strangely intimate at the same time. And I think I remember Richard Serron used to talk about this idea that a work of art is about, in some extent, it's about reconciling things that are opposite. So light and dark in a visual sense, or as you say, power and intimacy, and then all these other things, vanity, vulnerability, whatever. But I think that ability to have two seemingly opposite things in the same painting, and yet it absolutely works as a whole. It's coherent. I mean, that's the miracle of great art.
Francis Bacon, of course, he was obsessed with the painting of the Pope, and he painted it many, many times throughout his life. But when he went to Rome, he famously didn't go and see it. He didn't go and see the painting. I think he was intimidated. I think that sense of what you said about, it's very difficult to paint after seeing a Michelangelo. I think he was just too intimidated to see the Velasquez in the flesh, and he kind of wimped out.
I think all of us who paint, you as one, we have some sympathy with that. Even if whenever I go to Rome, and I go quite a lot at the moment, I find it very difficult. There's the Caravaggio churches, and then or the Pamphili. But I feel I haven't been to Rome unless I've done one of those two.
Right. Yeah. So how many times have you seen that painting of the Pope?
I mean, probably 20 something.
There's a very good copy in Apsley House in London. There's not such a good copy in Washington. Yeah. But the one in Apsley House is very good. And they do argue that maybe that was the study that he painted from life, prior to painting the actual,
Yeah, I mean,
executing the actual painting?
I mean, I think, no one would be able to say with any certainty, but it's not a, when you look at the, as you say, the freshness, the directness, and also just actually the sort of the roughness, a little bit of that, of some of the shapes in that painting, it has the feeling of something done directly and also quite quickly from life. Whereas, when you put the two side by side, you see that in the one that's in the Pamphili, it's it's not smoothed out. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful painting, but it's definitely been just sanded down a touch in certain places compared to the Apsley House study.
And it has a very interesting history that it was captured by Wellington in Spain. He captured part of Napoleon's army that was basically stealing the painting and taking it back to Paris. And he won this battle, captured the painting back from the French, and then the Spanish, as a thank you, gave it to Wellington later on, I think a couple of years later.
Nice present.
Yeah, very nice. Tom, let's do this again sometime. It's been my absolute pleasure talking to you as always. I love talking about art, especially the old masters. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, you could also try and get some funding. We come and do a talk in Florence.
I'd love to. Absolutely love to. Let's talk about
that. We could do one on location here.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, Tom, take care.
Great.
Thanks
talk,
a lot.
Bye-bye.